Everybody, and welcome to this side event. My name is Dr. Rebecca Naden. I'm the Director of Global Risks and Resilience at the Overseas Development Institute. And we are absolutely delighted to be hosting this high-level event this evening. We're going to be talking tonight about strengthening climate action in countries affected by protracted crisis. And we're delighted to have an esteemed panel of speakers. We're going to start the evening with two speakers, His Excellency Mr. Salah Jama, Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia, and His Excellency Dr. Jassim Abdullah Aziz Humadi, who's the Deputy Minister for Environment for Technical Affairs in Iraq. And why are we here today? We're here because it's vitally important that communities and countries affected by conflict and fragility and protracted crisis are recognised as some of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And in fact, of the 25 countries which are considered most vulnerable and least ready to adapt to climate change, over half are enduring conflict. Yet, despite their acute climate vulnerability, countries in protracted crisis face significant barriers to attracting climate finance. If we take Somalia, for example, climate finance inflows in 2019 to 2020 amounted to less than 1% of the amount which government estimates are required to adapt to climate change. And this includes the vertical climate funds, who, despite ostensibly being set up to allocate support to developing countries, are not delivering in these areas. And in fact, between May 2014 and 2021, extremely fragile states received only $2 per capita. That's $2 per capita, as opposed to $162 per capita in non-fragile states. Of course, we can't ignore the barriers to investing in and acting in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, of which are considerable. But resolving these issues will require the climate funds to have greater understanding of the risks involved in investing in areas of protracted crisis and how these can be managed. It's also going to require funds to ensure that their accreditation and application processes are faster and more flexible and better suited to the capacities of fragile governments. And it also, of course, is going to need political willpower to adopt a business unusual approach to financing climate action, not a business as usual approach. So supporting climate adaptation in situations of protracted crisis is undoubtedly about scaling up the finance, but it's also about ensuring that the finance is used effectively to build resilience. And we must focus on building countries' readiness to receive these funds, and must also support up more joined-up, risk-informed action amongst actors working in these contexts, including government, local communities, and people working in the humanitarian aid sector, as well as development, peace building, disaster management, and climate mitigation and adaptation. We need to move beyond these silos to ensure that climate risks are effectively managed. So I'm really looking forward today to hearing from some of the panelists about the challenges and lessons collaborating on building resilience in these contexts has meant. And it's really gratifying, actually, to see the COP28 presidency is so focused on this issue. We've been working on this issue since sort of COP26, but really we're delighted to see that COP28 is the first UN climate conference to have a thematic day related to relief, recovery and peace. And this will take place on the 3rd of December, as many of you know. And the presidency will also be releasing a declaration on climate relief, recovery and peace. And this really is calling for much bolder collective action to scale up finance and action. So not just the finance, but also action in fragile and conflict-affected areas. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you'll be aware, also COP28 marks the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. And this really is a chance for us to reflect on progress, but also to realign for the road ahead. So strengthening climate action in countries affected by protracted crisis, fragility and conflict should be a key part of that discussion. It can't be something that's ignored. And it's critical to fulfilling the Paris Agreement's commitments to support the most vulnerable to adapt to climate change, that these conditions are considered. So I'm really delighted to be moderating this event and really delighted to have you all here this evening. And we're going to hear from states, development and humanitarian actors, and also representatives of communities directly affected by protracted crisis and climate change, who are going to speak frankly and openly on what needs to be done to ensure these communities are able to access and implement the support that's necessary. So now I'm completely honoured to introduce His Excellency Salah Jam, the Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia, to come and give introductory remarks.
Good evening. The ministers from our brotherly states, members of the climate change community, practitioners, professionals that found the time to come and attend this very important forum today, focusing on the means and the ways of coping with climate change in countries that are faced with protracting situations. Situations that range from conflict, prolonged conflict, internally displaced people living in dire situations, and floods, droughts, and other circumstances that make people's livelihoods unbearable. Allow me to thank the leadership of this forum for convening this important gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change and its impact is being felt around the world, from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, the Antarctic, to almost all the continents. People are facing climate change in some very specific ways. But I think we all agree that the communities that live in fragile, conflict-prone, and protracted situations are the most vulnerable among all. So therefore, building on one of the key principles of the negotiations, which is a common responsibility, but a differentiated approach to resolving climate change impact. Tens, if not hundreds of millions of citizens of countries from Africa to some parts of the Arabian countries, South America, Pacific, Caribbean countries are facing severe consequences of climate change, albeit without them contributing very little to the root causes of climate change in terms of greenhouse emissions. It is a moral responsibility to find very specific and contextualized situations to the dire context in which the citizens find themselves in. As I stand here, I don't only speak for vulnerable communities in Somalia. I speak for those that are to be found in the Sahel, in Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Pacific countries, island countries, some of the Asian countries that are highly impacted by climate change. Just to give you a context, in Somalia, as I stand here before you now, over 2 million Somali citizens are displaced and find themselves in a place of destitute because of floods arising from El Nino, the highest rainfall in over 100 years. If we used to receive under 100 millimeters of rain in 3 seasons of rainy season, we receive around 300 millimeters of rain in a matter of 48 hours. These are not things that our citizens are equipped for and prepared for. I would like to highlight few very peculiar factors that make these nations vulnerable. with the principle that because of these difficult conditions, it is very difficult for them as individuals, as families, as communities, and at times as nations to compact with reoccurring and cyclical droughts, famines, and other natural calamities, all arising from climate change. These are not people that were destined to be poor. The people we talk about from around the regions that we all come from are nomads, agro-pastoralists, farmers, livestock herders, people who were leading a very dignified and respectable, productive lives, but find themselves season after season in situations beyond their control. Therefore, when we talk about combating climate change and adaptation, we must address the root causes of this. Another set of challenges faced by these communities is that their states that were supposed to prevent them from facing such disasters are also equally weak. When a drought hits California in the United States of America, you don't find people losing their lives. But in Somalia, or in the Sahel regions, or in some other parts of Asia, the loss of livestock is equal to the loss of livelihood and the eventual perishing of human life. Most of the countries that we come from and represent are already facing what we call a debt stress. Some of them have completed a HIPC initiative. Some of them have very limited fiscal space. So therefore, as we were naturally struggling with the sustainment of national development and sustainable development goals, like zero hunger, improving human capital, economic growth, when a livestock of millions and farming lands are destroyed in a matter of days, it is very difficult for the governments to both and pursue national development goals and combat climate change. Furthermore, in many of the countries that are in protracted situations, another underlying factor must be accounted for, and that is conflict. Conflict, climate change, and state fragility collectively combined create unbearable situations. And it's in such countries, fragile countries, where climate change truly becomes a threat multiplier. To conclude, as part of my opening remarks, I would leave for experts to deliberate about the options, and maybe we can have interactive process here. It is very important to ensure that the developments in the development community, the interventions carried out by the development community, the humanitarian interventions, and climate change finances must be combined, synergized, and collectively pursue objectives. Otherwise, without the right combination and a synchronized approach, it becomes a futile exercise because these things are cyclical and they are not going away. We have 3.5 million people displaced, and we're not finding a permanent solution for them. But if we involve development actors and get to the same table, humanitarian development and climate financing, perhaps we can find lasting solutions. Finally, if we closely examine, as I think practitioners from ODI and other research institutions would agree, is that the financing that comes from the vertical climate finance institutions like the Green Fund, GCF, and GEF, hardly go to fragile and recovering states. Therefore, we must find a very specific, tailored financing mechanisms for financing what should be a lasting and durable solutions for dealing with protracted situations. After 30 years, I would like to conclude with this story in the folklore of the Somali people. After 30 years, and after decades of talking about climate financing, for the average Somali or the average nomad or pastoralist, a discussion on climate change is akin to a hyena that was asked about the nature of milk. The hyena has never seen milk, but at night, it hears pastoralists passing milk from one household to the other. So when the hyena was asked about the milk, it concluded that it must be a dark element contained in dark containers and passed around at night. So discussions in beautiful places like here about climate financing should translate into life-saving actions for people who find themselves in extremely vulnerable places. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That is my problem tonight. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think you raised some really important points there, particularly, the point about, people leading dignified lives and the importance of being able to continue that. Also, as you say, this conflict, climate and state fragility, this is really where we see climate change as a threat multiplier. And also, I think just to reiterate this message that the vertical climate funds are not reaching the countries that we're talking about today. I think many in this venue, don't quite understand that. So that is also an important message to really get across. I would now like to invite our second high-level panelists, and I must begin by apologising very much to His Excellency for introducing the wrong person initially. Please do accept my apologies. So I'm actually delighted now to invite the correct person to come and speak and give remarks, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome His Excellency Dr. Awan Deab, who's the Minister of Water Resources from the country of Iraq, and we're delighted to have you, sir. The floor is yours.
أصحاب المعالي، أصحاب السعادة، الأخوة الحضور، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحقيقة أنا يسعدني أن أشارك في هذه الجلسة المهمة جدا، ولتبحث نقاط حيوية تتعلق في أمور بدرجة عالية من الأهمية، وهي موضوع التغييرات المناخية. أنا الواقع حتى أكون راح أعرج على نقطة حيوية تتعلق في بلدي العراق. العراق يصنف كونه المتأثر بشدة من موضوع التغييرات المناخية، وأكثر الدول هشاشة في مواجهة هذه التغيرات. أيضاً النقطة الأخرى هي كون مصادر المياه في العراق هي من خارج الحدود، يعني 75% من مواردنا المائية تأتي من خارج الحدود. هذه العوامل أثرت بشكل حاد على الوضع المائي في العراق، وأصبح تحدي كبير وتحدي مؤثر على حياة الناس. إضافة إلى هذا، تعلمون أن العراق للأسف الشديد تعرض إلى الكثير من الحروب والاعتداءات، وآخرها كان اعتداءات داعش اللي كان لها تأثير أيضا كبير على المنظومة المائية في العراق بسبب احتلاله للعديد من السدات والسدود في ذاك الوقت. هذه كلها كانت ضغوط إضافية أثرت بشكل حاد على المنظومة المائية وعلى الوضع البيئي في العراق، مما سبب إلى مشاكل حقيقية. حالياً هناك صراعات على المورد، لأن المورد محدود، الاحتياجات كبيرة، فتوزيع المورد أصبح صعب جداً. لهالسبب هناك نشاهد كثير من النزاعات في المجتمعات القائمة على هذه الأنهر، وفعلاً أحياناً تصل إلى مستوى الصراع. هذه فضلاً عن أن هناك العديد من المجتمعات القاطنة على الأنهر والمستفيدة منه من المياه تأثرت بشكل كبير، وخاصة المجتمعات اللي تقطن في مناطق الأهوار. حضراتكم تدركون ما أهمية أهوار جنوب العراق. واقع هذه الأهوار بيئة خاصة إيكولوجيا، ذات خواص مهمة لا تخدم فقط العراق. هي تعرف هذه الأهوار هي ممتلك عالمي حاليا دخل ضمن لائحة التراث العالمي لأهميتها، لكن نجد صعوبة باستدامة هذه الأهوار وبقائها حية وبقائها منتعشة بسبب النقص الحاد في مواردنا المائية، وبسبب التغيرات اللي حدثت، التغيرات المناخية اللي قلت من الساقط المطري وارتفاع درجات الحرارة. حقيقة عندنا معلومات أو هذا ما مسجل أنه ارتفاع درجات الحرارة أصبح تجاوز الحدود المعقولة، لربما نصف درجة الغليان تجاوزناها، وحاليا نتجه باتجاه درجة الغليان، لأن الحياة أصبحت صعبة في بيئة مثل بيئة العراق، مما يحتاج أن يكون هناك إدراك مهم من المجتمع الدولي لهذه المخاطر وإيجاد سبل المعالجة بشتى الطرق. الحقيقة احنا في جانبنا كحكومة في العراق حاليا هناك توجه جاد باتخاذ أو التكيف مع هذه الحالة، وأيضا التخفيف. الحكومة العراقية اتخذت قرارات جيدة وجريئة بالفترة الأخيرة بشأن التخفيف من آثار انبعاثات الغازات، وخاصة في مجال إعطاء أكثر من 5 إجازات تراخيص لشركات رصينة من أجل استثمار الغاز والغاز المصاحب اللي يحرق حاليا، إضافة إلى توجهنا إلى إنشاء التوليد أو إنتاج الكهرباء عن طريق الخلايا الشمسية. هذه العوامل كلها يعني تدعونا إلى أن نريد أن تصل إلى المجتمع الدولي، تصل إلى الناس المعنيين في هذا الجانب، أن يكون هناك جدية في دعم العراق، دعم موقفه بالنسبة لما يعانيه. هناك حالات من النزوح للأسف الشديد في مناطق الأهوار اللي يعتمدون أساساً في حياتهم على تربية الحيوانات، خاصة الجاموس اللي هو يعتبر يعني ثروة حيوانية مهمة في مناطق الأهوار، تأثر بالفترة الأخيرة وأصبح يعني هناك نزوح كبير من مناطق الأهوار. هذه كلها العوامل تصب في يعني نقطة حيوية، أنه يجب أن ننظر إلى هذه التحديات بمستوى عالي من الإدراك، لأن هذه تشكل مخاطر عالية على مستقبل المجتمعات في هذه البقعة من الأرض. ومثل ما قلت، الأهوار العراق هي ملك الإنسانية وليس ملك العراق فقط، وكذلك نهري دجلة والفرات. حقيقة هي لم تكن ولن تكون نهرين عراقيين، إنها نهرين امتدان إلى آلاف السنين. هذه المنطقة منطقة ما بين النهرين، منطقة وادي الرافدين، منطقة أرض السواد، أصبحت تشكو العطش حالياً وتشكو تأثيرات حادة في التغيرات المناخية، مما يجب على المجتمع الدولي أن يلتفت بجدية لهذا الموضوع. طبعاً أنا لربما ما كنت مهيئ لهذه الكلمة، لكن هذه مجرد أرجو المعذرة، يعني كان الموضوع أوسع بكثير ممكن، وما أريد أطيل عليكم، وأتصور استطعت أن أوصل لكم فكرة أو بشكل أو بآخر لما يعانيه العراق. وشكراً لإصغائكم وشكراً جزيلاً.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for that speech. I think you did convey very well many of the challenges that Iraq is facing. And as you pointed out very clearly, it's people that obviously are suffering from conflict, but also how conflict seriously impacts the natural resources upon which people's livelihoods depend. And also, as you pointed out so eloquently, actually we're talking here about many transboundary natural resources. So it's not only conflict in one country that impacts the people in that country, but we can see, as with climate change, as with conflict, how these threats impact on very vital transboundary resources. So thank you so much for that. We're now going to move to our panel discussion, the second part of our panel discussion. So I would like to invite, sorry, the lights are in my eyes. So if I'm looking a bit unsure who I'm looking at, it's because of that. We'd like to invite Mr. Robert Mardini, Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, to come and talk to us about some of the work that his 20,000 plus staff are doing in more than 100 countries, and how ICRC's work in supporting climate action in protracted crisis is going. Mr. Mardini, the floor is yours. Yeah, it's up to you, wherever you're most comfortable.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I will start by saying that I was very moved when listening to the Minister of Water of Iraq and the Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia, because it reminded me of my early days as a humanitarian, as a water engineer in Iraq and Somalia, where we were very much grappling with the same type of challenges communities and countries are grappling with today. I remember in Iraq back in 1999, we had a program to extend the length of the intakes of all the water, of most water treatment plants along the Tigris River in order to ensure the continuity of water supply. In Somalia, I remember the many programs where we had to ensure that the floodings were contained, and we were supporting the communities with sandbags to hire the banks of the Shabelle River. And at the same time, we were trying to also increase the depth of the boreholes in Somalia because the water table was running dry. And I think although all those problems that, the 16 countries you mentioned, Rebecca, but many more are facing today, these problems are not new, but they have been steadily exacerbated with the more visible effects of climate shocks and climate changes. And the countries already affected by cycles of war and violence are the hardest hit, and communities are the least equipped to absorb those shocks, and they deserve the full attention of the international community. They deserve that climate action be prioritized to them, and also climate finance. And these are not just sound bites. And as a humanitarian, I'm not here advocating for more humanitarian funding. It's really these resources, the climate action and finance, should go to those communities and those countries, and the mechanism should be found in order to make breakthrough work happen urgently for those communities. At ICRC, we have recently published Weathering the Storm publication, just showcasing that actually it's possible to make a difference in those very places affected by the combined effects of conflict and climate change in Niger, in Mozambique, and in the Gaza Strip. Our engineers were able to develop projects that actually reinforced or strengthened the resilience of communities in Niger. It was about protecting cultivation of rice against floods, or also protecting grazing lands that are scarce and dwindling against wildfires. And this made a significant difference for communities. In Mozambique, for communities affected by a very violent conflict where thousands were displaced because of the conflict and the water supply schemes were destroyed. We were able to rehabilitate the water supply scheme, but we also came up with a master plan where other actors can take over and complement this work. And in the Gaza Strip, we invested a lot in the water supply schemes, and also ensuring that enough power is provided to water treatment plants. We also supported farmers to be able to cope with erratic rainfall and erratic weather pattern that made it extremely difficult for them to farm along the border areas. Of course, now the conflict has disrupted all this, but it shows that small investment in those difficult places make actually a real difference, and that here it makes the case for development actors to step in and to take those interventions at speed and to scale in order to make a significant change for those very communities. So I will maybe leave it here and over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that. I think, as you say, these problems aren't new, and we need to avoid what can sometimes be described as fatigue in the international community about the need to address these. But I think, as we heard as well from His Excellency Salah Jama, that actually this is about dignity, and it's about ensuring that these issues and these challenges are brought to the attention of that international community. And also, I would like to say, I think as Robert would say himself, it is possible to be doing better and to do more. And on that note, I actually invite you all to read ICRC's new report, Weathering the Storm, which I think really lays out the ways in which ICRC, both in the short term, but also with that long-term perspective, is really thinking about building resilience in these fragile areas. So I would now like to introduce you all to our next speaker. So our next speaker, Mr. Zamir Iqbal, who is the Vice President for Finance for the Islamic Development Bank. He previously headed up the World Bank's Global Islamic Finance Development Center in Istanbul, and has a lot of experience, obviously, in the issue of financial risk and risk sharing. So, Mr. Iqbal, the floor is yours, and he's going to give us an overview of how Islamic Development Bank is developing a comprehensive response and some of the gaps that you're filling. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone, Excellencies, distinguished guests. It's indeed my pleasure to be here and sharing some of my thoughts. I must say that the opening speeches by the Excellency from Somalia as well as Excellency from Iraq were very touching. Indeed, they were very spontaneous and coming from the heart. And I'm also pleased that both of these countries are member countries of Islamic Development Banks, and which we are very, hopefully we are providing a good service to them. Now, before I start, I really would like to thank our thanks to Government of Somalia, ODI, UNHCR, and ICRC to partner with Islamic Development Bank in organizing in this event. Now, it's very, I'm very pleased that we are together over here to make sure to address some of these issues which are really very dear to all of us. we at Islamic Development Bank, we are 57 member countries which span all the way all over the globe practically, ranging from Africa to Latin America to South Asia, East Asia, and North Africa. So as a multilateral development bank, of course, our first focus is on achieving long-term sustainable development as well as the poverty alleviation. However, as you know that with the new challenges coming up because of the climate, you cannot have a long-term sustainable development without addressing some of the core challenges. Climate is, of course, one of them, very high on our agenda. In our member countries, we pay very special attention to it because of one particular reason, that 31 out of 57 member countries in Islamic Development Bank member countries are classified as fragile countries. Out of those, 29 countries are least developed, which means that they are IDA receiving countries. So these are the countries which are mostly affected by protracted crises and exceptionally susceptible to effects of the change in the climate. They're already vulnerable, but because of climate, they become much more vulnerable in that because they're more vulnerable towards their livelihood and the resilience. So we are also, Islamic Development Bank is one of the largest south-to-south development bank, which means that we do not have any of the major G7 or the other countries. We do help each other from south to south, and we make sure that all of member countries do achieve the objectives of Paris climate, and we achieve it by, over the period of time, we have developed very robust climate change policy and action plan. We have a fragility and resilience policy, and we have other relevant sector and thematic policies which address women empowerment as well as the youth development. Now, this is much about who we are. Now I will come and share what do we do and how do we do. So we are more than 48 years old. Next year we'll be celebrating our 50th anniversary. In that sense, we have a long history and long experience of achieving the sustainable economic development through knowledge, technical assistance, and capacity building and financing. Now, if we start with the knowledge capacity building and knowledge management, we are very proud of a very specialized program called Reverse Linkages Program, which means South helping the South, which means that within our member countries, rather than relying on the aid from any other countries, we rely from one member country on the principle of solidarity, helping other countries, and that is called reverse linkages, where we share knowledge and expertise in different sectors and themes. Second, regarding on the knowledge, we keep improving. We are recently working on a knowledge piece that how we can enhance and provide the services of Islamic insurance, which is called the kafil, to smallholder farming, so that they can try to mitigate some of the risk of falling into poverty. Now, I think you know that many of our member countries, there are our constituencies, they do prefer getting financing and these services which follow the principles of Islamic finance. So from that angle, we work on those. Now, when it comes to financing, we mobilize almost about $5 billion every year from global capital markets. I'm very pleased that in 2019, after working very extensively on developing a sustainable finance framework, we launched our first €1 billion green Islamic bond. And that was followed up by another two bond issuance of sustainability bonds. These sustainability bonds were both mobilized, the funds were mobilized to fight for the social climate action as well as the social development. Many member countries have, as I have said earlier, that they are affected by this protracted crisis, and since these are one of those are very poor countries, we do help them with the grants and concessional finance. Most of our focus is on adaptation measures rather than the mitigation, because that is what the strong demand from our member countries is on achieving the adaptation. I just share two examples with you. One of them is in 2022, one of our member countries, Pakistan, faced a very devastating flooding. Whereas it was 1/3 of the country was was affected by flooding. Now, we, Islamic Development Bank, grouped together, responded by committing about $4.2 billion financing in support of climate-resilient Pakistan. Our support will help Pakistan move from rescue and relief phase to enormous task of recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. Another example was earlier this year, there was a devastating earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. Over there, now we are working with them in the reconstruction and rejuvenation of the sectors, particularly in agriculture. Although both of these cases are very unfortunate, but however, this gives us some opportunity that we can go back and we make the recovery more green and more resilient. And I think that is we work together to make sure that how we achieve this objective. In our new strategy, we are focusing ourselves on building sustainable, resilient, and green infrastructure. So with that, I'm really thank you for your attention. I hope that the discussion here and at this event lead to concrete actions, and you can find Islamic Development Bank as partner in many of these initiatives. Thank you so much.
Mr. Iqbal, thank you so much for that, and also wishing, of course, the IDB a happy birthday, happy 50th birthday for next year. But perhaps more importantly, I think it's really interesting and important to hear a bank with a strong focus on adaptation. We often see many of the sort of financing bankable projects being seen more in the space of mitigation, but actually to really see adaptation as a focus. And also to hear more about your new strategy building not just sustainable green infrastructure, but that very important word of resilient infrastructure. So thank you very much. It's now my pleasure, and I'm delighted to introduce Hans Olav Ibrek, who is the Policy Director of the Section for Energy, Climate and Food Security at the Norwegian Foreign Affairs and the Climate Envoy for Norway, with an extensive experience in this field, focusing on climate, energy and environmental finance. Ms. Ober is going to talk to us some of the experience from Norway in scaling up finance in countries of fragility and protracted crisis. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and also thanks to the two ministers for their opening remarks that really gave us a compelling story why we are all together here at COP26 and why we have to urgently do business here at COP26. Of course, to address many of the problems that you've highlighted attributed to climate change, we need to work more actively on mitigation because that's our first line of defense. But of course, adaptation, increasing resilience and increasing our support to adaptation is key. Rebecca, you also mentioned that we're not delivering on climate finance, and I have a confession to make because I was appointed on the board of the Adaptation Fund in 2008 when it was set up. I served on the board for maybe almost 10 years. I was the chair of the Adaptation Fund for 2 years, and I've been serving now on the board of the GCF since 2017. So you can blame me why it is so difficult to get access to climate finance. Quite often when my minister meet her colleagues, I always get a note back saying they all complain about the complicated procedures and difficulties to get access to climate finance. And I'm actually pointing back at the minister and saying that, yes, but we have to comply with all kinds of procedures, all kinds of guidelines, and all kinds of policies. And frankly speaking, I've never heard a colleague from a developing country, the recipient countries, asking for a new policy. They're always coming from my side of the table, even though I don't like to use that term. But when I'm pointing at someone, there's always 3 fingers pointing back at myself and 1 up there. So I need to get my own house in order. So I think collectively we need to look into this. And Robert, you said we need a new mechanism. And I believe when I see the new mechanism, I can say, yes, that's the new mechanism we need, but what kind of mechanism that we need to develop? I don't have the answer in order to come up with something. But like I said, we all know what the work that we have to do. Let me just briefly address some of the issues that I've been working on lately. And of course, that is the links between climate change and security. And of course, we know that from a research perspective, the links are contested. But I think the 2 ministers also clearly underline why the links are actually quite clear, and we cannot wait until researchers have actually established the links, because we as decision makers, or at least advisors to decision makers, we can't sit and wait for scientists to agree. We need to act now, and we need to act as quickly as possible. But let's face it, we are not set up to do business in countries in protracted situations. It's extremely difficult for us because we don't have the staff. We are not trained to do it. We don't have the people that are willing to go and spend 2 or 3 years in many of these countries. There are risk situations. So this is an issue for us to find the right people that can actually do the job. Who should we work with? In many cases, they are not a real government. You can take the case now of Afghanistan. In order to get support from the Green Climate Fund or all these international mechanisms, the government needs to sign off on a letter saying that they approve of this project. Should we then work with non-state actors? We have to work with NGOs and the UN. So it's difficult also to spend because the capacity and the framework is not really there. So I actually disagree a little bit with the point of departure that Rebecca made, and I've also made this remark to the UAE colleagues and also UNDP, that you cannot just divide climate finance on number of countries and you say that fragile countries get less than what they deserve, because you need to factor in the ability to spend as well. The complicated procedures, I've told you why they are so complicated, how to make them more effective, and we all have to work together in order to do so. From our side, at least, we've now merged the political responsibility between the humanitarian side and the development space. So now we have 1 minister in my house who is responsible for the whole envelope, and not, as we've had it before, that this has been separated. Unfortunately, we know that climate change will become more serious. Like I said, we just need to include climate change risk in all our activities, as well as we need to make sure that our climate change actions are also conflict sensitive, and we don't have conflict sensitive policies. One issue that hasn't been brought up here in the discussion so far is that when we were in the Security Council, we wanted to reframe the agenda to climate peace and security, and not only focus on climate and security, because we see that joint climate action is also a potential way of building trust and confidence. We have few examples of that, but we are now supporting some efforts in Somalia, and I'm really looking forward to get more examples of how can we use combined climate action to build trust and confidence as a tool to create peace. So with those words, I would like to end my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. And I think we can all, admire Hans's self-reflection there. And also, thanks to him as well for outlining some of those risks. And yes, you're absolutely right. It's understandable the need to factor in the ability to spend the money. And also, Hans's frank admission about the lacking of conflict-sensitive policies. And I think that's part of moving towards a solution in each actor, each stakeholder being able to recognise some of the limitations, but also looking to solutions. And we're going to hear again in a minute from the Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia on some of the solutions that he'd like to share with us. But before we do, we're going to do something a little bit different for tonight's event. I'm delighted to invite Emital Mahmoud to come. Emi is a Sudanese-American slam poet, so there's something different, and a former refugee and a UNHCR supporter since 2016. Emi was born in Darfur in Sudan, and is going to come tonight and tell us a little bit about some of the refugees and her experiences and challenges that they've been facing. Ms. Mahmoud, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. As you said, my name is Imtithal Mahmoud. I'm called Emi. I'm a Sudanese-American world champion poet and author and goodwill ambassador for UNHCR. And it's such an honor to be here among all of these wonderful excellencies and just getting to hear some of the spaces that are generally neglected, especially being from Sudan, being from Darfur, born in Khartoum, raised in the US. For me, it really means a lot to be able to stand here in front of you and get to speak about things that are very near and dear to my heart. I think, when I thought about this talk, I thought I could maybe go through some of the stats. Like, for example, we know that over 70% of the world's refugees and asylum seekers come from the most climate vulnerable countries, including Afghanistan, the DRC, Syria, Yemen, and more, and nearly 3 in every 10 refugees and asylum seekers. More than 7 out of 10 internally displaced people are hosted in highly climate vulnerable countries. I could tell you that women and children are more than, 14 times more likely to be affected or killed by climate change. And I could tell you so much more about how people are sometimes not just once, but twice, maybe 3 times displaced, for conflict, climate, and so much more. The reality is that vulnerable people are seldom ever vulnerable in one way. And when we talk about these issues, we're not just talking about crises. We use the language of disaster as if it's something that is not preventable, as if it's something that we can't do anything about. But the reality is what we're dealing with here are problems, and problems have solutions. And that's something that is so crucial for me to say. When you look at the numbers, there are millions and millions of people all across Sudan, the world, wherever it is, if you think about it, and in our countries, like we saw what happened in Libya, Morocco, all these different areas, we are seen as casualties of inevitabilities. And all of those things just tend to erase us even more than the climate issues or conflict and everything does. As you mentioned, as one of the excellencies mentioned, he mentioned that climate tends to be something that is a risk multiplier. And what you said about Iraq really almost made me cry, thinking about the 2 rivers. Like Sudan is home to the Nile. The Nile could feed the world, but instead we're suffering, and more than 7 million people have now been displaced by the recent crisis. I alone, since April, have lost 6 family members in Sudan. And it's heartbreaking not only because of the loss and the fact that we can't even go to our family's funerals, but the reality is that I am someone who actually has a platform. I'm a goodwill ambassador for UNHCR. I'm one of BBC's 100 most inspirational women. I'm a lot of different things, but still, when you speak truth to power, and between the time that you speak truth to power and power finally acts, there's a buffer zone where you lose people. So I've lost a lot of people while speaking in rooms like this. So for me, it is time that we all make a change and create the kind of solutions that will really, really solve these problems. Solutions that I had the honor of seeing in Cameroon very recently. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting with Luca and Leatu, two refugees in Cameroon that I've been working with for a couple of years and bringing their stories to COP, and just seeing these incredible initiatives that they created. Because refugees and vulnerable people are not only on the front lines of the climate crisis, but they're also at the forefront of change. They're innovating faster and more creatively with more limited resources than any of us could ever imagine. So what does redesigning our solutions or our approach to change look like? And why is it that I wrote this poem that I'm going to be sharing with you? What it looks like to me is putting vulnerable people at the forefront of change as equals at the same table, and understanding that the smartest environmental engineers are people like my grandmother, who was able to feed a whole village during the famine, or people like Leatu, who is reforesting part of the Sahel in Minawao camp, or people like Luca, who was one of the 5 people who came up with this initiative. They started with 500 trees, and now literally hundreds of thousands of trees have been planted, biobriquettes, you name it. What does this mean? It means that those of us who are relegated to the periphery, whether we are refugees, indigenous people, vulnerable populations, or countries with protracted issues, who are not seen as the center of the status quo. It really touched me what you said about IDB being south to south, and a lot of our solutions being something about us leaning towards each other. What it means is that when we're constantly relegated to the periphery, solutions tend to just reinforce the status quo, and I'm saying we upend it. And I think we can do that with those of us who are in this room and those of us who we represent and are bringing into the space with us. And that's what I try to do with my poetry, what we try to do when we strategize, and what I want you to keep in mind when you're moving forward. When you think about the world that you want to see, think not just about, proving a point or spending resources the right way. Think about the people who are there every day doing the work without what it is that you have at your disposal. The last thing that I want to say that really opened my eyes to how effective it is to fund solutions that are created and fostered by the people themselves is, I told you that they planted hundreds of thousands of trees in Minawao. There was an issue before where the temporary housing that was being funded by all the NGOs was being destroyed year after year by the windstorms and wind gusts. That stopped 5 years ago. When the trees started to really take root, they actually stopped the windstorm issue. And it actually ended up saving so much money for UNHCR and other places as well. So the innovators, the financiers, the geniuses who can really solve these issues are on the ground doing the work every day with limited resources. Imagine what they could do with your support. So this poem is called The Song of the Earth, and it calls back to my people, to my family, to my grandma, and to all of the people who are trying to help everyone remember and understand that this is how we move forward. Okay, thank you. I hope you like this poem. This is a different part. It means a lot to me to be able to share this with you and to just remind everyone of our humanity. Because when you're seeing numbers, it's hard to remember the people that we're losing. So this is to remind you. The song of the earth is sung in morning dews and honeysuckle tones. It's resting in the bends of the Nile and waving across the leaves of a weeping willow. The song of the earth is humming in the depth of our bones and crescendos when a sprout first breaks through the soil to reach toward that painted sky, or a child takes its first breath. It whispers when the birds fly to their second home in the winter and wails when some of them don't return. The song of the earth is relentless. It is a retelling of warnings of old and a cry for help to those who still listen for it, who still feel it resonating deep beneath the concrete, a lamenting generations in the making, a pleading to remember who we are. I didn't know what I was missing until I went back home and saw the clouds. High above the skies of Darfur, I tried to make sense of it, lingering day after day. When I finally asked my uncle Bakri, he says, "That's not a cloud, it's the Milky Way. If you're ever lost, just follow the Milky Way home." How could I explain to him just how lost I was? How could I make him understand just how far we'd strayed from the knowledge of our ancestors? How could I tell him that the sky hadn't shone blue in a very long time, and the stars didn't appear in a few years? That getting fresh air was a luxury and experiencing nature a distant dream for most of us. And that the Milky Way, the sight of it a birthright I didn't know was mine, was a stranger to my eyes. When did we become trespassers? When did we forget how to listen to the world around us? When did we lose the connection to what makes this our home? We are as much a part of nature as a sapling or a waterfall, earth an inheritance shared by all of us, but no longer equally. People and planet are one and the same. Forgetting this will be our downfall. My friend Faris told me, deep beneath the layers of the Sahel and all across the world, mycelia connect everything like neurons in one organism. I wonder when we lost the power to feel those signals. We, absentee members of nature, connected in crisis. Thousands lost in Libya, Morocco, land, sea, and sky lives, human lives caught in between, human lives hanging in the balance, firestorms in Hawaii, earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, Hurricane Idalia, floods in New York and China, cyclones, evacuations of hundreds of thousands. The thing about resilience is it becomes harder to do without your tools. My people, we draw on home, but we have been forced from home. We draw on community, but disaster has torn us apart. The earth, it draws on balance, and all things in homeostasis. But we have broken that balance. It isn't hubris that makes us believe we can possess the earth, that we can take and give nothing back. It is forgetfulness. Memories that were held in the hands of our elders before they had the chance to pass it down. When the earth stood still, we had a moment to remember. Removed from the equation, earth had a chance to recover. There were deer in the city streets, the skies shone blue as the sea once was. The birds came home and the waters cleared. The ozone hole began to close. Seeing how the earth grows in our absence became a reminder that the earth responds. Can you hear it, the song of the earth? Can you feel the falcons calling? Can you sense the wind carrying the voices of the trees? Can you taste the drops of long-awaited rain and smell the cooling clay as it seeps below? Earth still works. We just stopped doing our part. My mind may forget, but my body remembers the things my grandmother knew, what nature gives us, and more importantly, what we must give back. The roads our ancestors walked, memorized, like the veins on the back of our hands, moving in harmony, sharing a destination and a source. When I stand in the desert, I now know that the sand has memories of greenery, and beneath it all, dreams of return. What connects us is so much more than desperation or loss or fear of catastrophe. What connects us is our shared memory of our home planet, our love and fear of water, how we gaze at the stars and the stars gaze back. It's in our laughter and the home we carry in our heart. It's in our voices and the stories we tell with our souls. It's in our future and the paths we will forge together. It's in this moment and in our chance to begin again. Our chance to learn to love something without possessing it, to see a bird in flight and not cage it, to marvel at the earth and not claim it, to become who we used to be, lovers of all things green and warm. My godfather Timothy reminds me, a river that forgets its roots will soon dry up. This is your reminder. Home is calling. Will you answer the call? Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to, I'll close by saying something that might help in the future, that I'm a poet, but I studied anthropology and molecular cellular developmental biology at Yale, going into medicine. I'm a scientist, but I choose poetry because I believe when you speak to somebody politically, they'll respond politically. If you speak academically, they'll respond academically. If you speak with hate, they will respond with hate. But if you speak with your humanity, they will respond with their humanity. So please speak with your humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think that was absolutely wonderful, Emmy. Thank you so much. And just so many important reminders there. I mean, I think as Emmy said, you know, these people that we're talking about are not just experiencing one crisis, but it's one after the other. Also, I think your point very much about speaking truth to power, and in that space, the losses, both human and ecosystem, are growing. And also, your phrase about those relegated to the periphery, actually in many countries, you know, this is increasingly the case. But I just want to thank you for that beautiful, beautiful piece of poetry. It was very emotive, it was very heartwarming, and I think you just really captured beautifully the glory of nature and how for many that is a distant dream for some. But if we can perhaps regain our balance and that connection, then, you know, the earth is us and we are the earth. And we have a number of, you know, bringing it slightly back to the political, we have, you know, the UNFCCC, but we also have the UN Convention on Combating Desertification. We have the UN Convention on biodiversity. So actually, at the kind of political level, we have these frameworks, but we also need to bring these together more. We are coming to the end of our event, but I wanted to just open up the floor to the audience if you have any questions for our esteemed panelists. And also, I know His Excellency, the Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia, also has one last intervention to share with us. Sir, the floor is yours if you want to share your last.
But I can't be loud enough.
Should be.
All right. I think after Imtidal spoke, it is very difficult to speak after her. Coming from a nation of poets myself, I truly appreciate the way you have depicted the plight of people. I was thinking of another poet by the name Robert Frost as I propose something. And I appreciating the insights mentioned by representatives of the donor community, the special envoy on climate change from Norway, who spoke very candidly in relation to the lack of capacity in some of these developing countries in terms of having access to climate finance. Robert Frost, in his poem, talks about, if I'm not mistaken, I was introduced to it many years ago, the road less traveled, was it? So there is one road that has been traveled quite a number of times in the past. It's about responding to crisis, humanitarian responses. In the last 1 year, $2 billion were spent in trying to deal with droughts in Somalia. Few months after that, another $1 billion is expected to be spent on dealing with floods. Such an ironic turn of events. Yesterday's victims, or survivors rather, of droughts could be today's victims of floods. The humanitarian model of responding to crisis, making humanitarian appeals at the hour of crisis, will not help us deal with climate change and will not help us either mitigate it or adapt to it. Therefore, I make the following proposal. Number one, we must come with a different set of instruments or either reform the current ones to mend the issues at hand. According to the Somalia's National Determinant Contribution, NDC, we are expected to spend $16 billion in the coming 5-6 years before 2030. Per year, apparently we're supposed to spend about a couple of $1 billion. We only spend now $300 million on something called climate financing, which in reality is about humanitarian financing. So for me, I would make the following proposal. In fact, Norway has done an extensive study in Somalia on deep underground water and has figured out that Somalia has humongous amount of water in deep underground sources. If we can resolve the issue of water, the crisis of Somalia resulting in droughts or management of floods can be permanently resolved. So our NDC and our National Development Plan and our post-HIPC development objectives are going to focus on investment in water, not in water tracking, but water management and water storage. That needs huge amounts of money. If you look at the number of projects under the name of climate finance that are being implemented in Somalia, very few of them exceed $500,000. $500,000 cannot bring about what we call transformational change. They may save a life for today. Finally, the multilateral development banks should focus on averting climate impact in a meaningful way. After 30 years, we are here as part of the developing countries, LDCs, sub-Saharan countries, to be part of the solution. It would be a very, very dire situation after 30 years if we are discussing about the capacity of African states. To conclude, sorry to make a long intervention, I speak on behalf of people whose lives are under threat as we speak. After 30 years, if we're talking about capacity building, I cannot imagine the kind of poem that my good friend here will be telling us. So now is the time to invest in. And finally, this is not asking for a handout. This is not people seeking unjustified help. This is about a responsibility that is purely on the shoulders of those that have polluted the world. Africa contributes to less than 3%. The amount of energy consumed by the whole of Africa and the energy consumed by Germany and France are different. In terms of industry, Africa consumes less than 1% of energy in the industry front. So our countries are the front lines. When I say African, I speak for everybody. Africa is the origin of humanity. Most of our countries have had very little to do with contributing to this situation. I think at the 30th one? 28th COP? I think we lost one or two in the, what do you call it? Yeah. 28. The 28th one, we should find damage, remedial measures for us to find permanent solutions in infrastructural projects, in fisheries, in huge development agenda projects, not in humanitarian response. We're sick and tired of that, and we have developed the capacity to help our people with the help of our international partners who help us consistently, but we want to find a permanent solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've just been told by the administrative staff that we have to vacate the room, but just before we get chucked out, I just wanted to ask if anyone else in the panel would like to share any final remarks. No pressure, just asking.
I'd be happy to. Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you for your kind words, and I mean, like, if anyone else wanted to speak, I'll. But I fully agree with what you're saying, and I think two things came to mind, which is the first thing, which is something that our High Commissioner a very long time ago, Ogata, once said. She said that there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. And a lot of people misunderstand what she meant, thinking like that means there's no solutions. No, what she meant is that there are political solutions, there are financial solutions, there are development solutions. There are no humanitarian solutions because the problems that are humanitarian issues are not actually created our humanity, it's created by a lot of issues of state, conflict, whatever else it is. And it's amazing to hear someone who is one of the world leaders saying similar things to what we say as indigenous people who polluted the world and who will take responsibility. The second thing is that a lot of institutions, companies, states, whatever it is, are not willing to engage with risk. So what does that mean? It means that people, especially young people, are left to engage with risk with nothing but their own bodies. So we are literally dying for our lives. We're engaging with risk with nothing there. So I think that maybe the most important thing to tell everyone moving forward is hear what we said and be brave enough to stand the way that a refugee or an indigenous person or a young person does. Understand that we really are at the end of our ropes here, out of time, and that if a young person who does not have anywhere near as many years on this earth as you did or as money resources is willing to engage with risk on that level, then you should be brave enough to do the same thing. So be brave and be honest and take responsibility.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emmy. And I think, unfortunately, that concludes our event this evening, but I would really like to thank all of our panelists who actually, I think, have been very candid, very open and very frank in their remarks. And as you say, it is about understanding the risk, embracing the risk, but also thinking about who bears the responsibility for managing that risk. But really a huge thanks to everybody on tonight's panel, and thank you also to you, the audience, for coming as well, as I know it's rather late. Thank you very much.